Gotham Investigations, and I'm your host, Jeff Giordano. Miami-Dade Pre-Trial Detention Center, probably considered one of the worst holding facilities while you are waiting your trial in the United States. But what happens when an officer gets arrested and is behind bars? Stay tuned. You're going to hear what goes on behind the scenes and behind the bars of this facility. This is Gotham Investigations, and I'm your host, Jeff Giordano. In this season, Sergeant Jesus Menocal could be facing some serious time behind bars if he's found guilty or if he takes a plea. We have a special guest on our show today. He is a former correctional officer with Miami-Dade County. Miami-Dade County Pre-Trial Detention Center is probably considered one of the most violent facilities in the United States. It houses sometimes well over 4,000 prisoners that are facing a year or more in prison if they're found guilty at their trial. Sometimes these trials could take up to 4 years, 6 years, 7 years, depending on the state attorney's office. And he is going to take us behind the scenes of what goes on in this facility. Alex Abella, here he is.
Hey, Jeff.
Welcome, Alex.
Hey, thank you.
And tell us a little bit about your passion for corrections. I know you were formerly a correctional officer, but you do have a lot of passion for the people that work there behind the bars because you face and you see so many things. Take us through the process. If someone from the street is arrested for a violent crime, armed robbery, murder, rape, what is the process from the time that police officer pulls up into I believe it's called the Sally Port,
right,
there,
the booking area.
And the booking area. Take us through that process.
Okay, and just let me just digress a little. So you made a comment in terms of a lot of respect for the people that work in the department and in that role. So, you know, most of the officers, and this is important to know because people watch movies and they have a misconception. Most of the officers are just good, hardworking people that are doing a job, putting in their 40 hours. They have families, and they're trying to do the best job possible. They're unsung heroes, so it's not like a firefighter or a police officer that you get to see them in action out on the street. They're behind the scenes, but they're putting their life on the line every day, whether it's through physical contact or exposure to different diseases, etc. A lot of stress in the job. So I just want to take the opportunity to say that. So one of the reasons I'm still very passionate, even though I'm not a correction officer today, about that industry and about that particular segment of the public safety or law enforcement community is because they are the unsung heroes, and they're there, facing what's the cumulative, right, of crime. As an officer, you may see 2 or 3 criminals maybe a day, maybe a week. In a facility, you're seeing thousands, right? So it's the receptacle of all those criminals at once, and you have to deal with them at scale. So you could be dealing with 20, 30, 40, 50, 100. So just kind of as a overarching theme as I'm talking about the process. So getting back to your point. So let's start with, the arrests. Whichever department within Miami-Dade County arrests the individual, they may process them, interview them at the station, and ultimately take them to, at one point was the main jail. I think now they're being processed at TGK, but the procedures are very similar. So it starts with classification. So I want you to think about 2 legs. You have felons and you have misdemeanors. So those are 2 different crime classifications. And typically, I'm not a legal expert, but in terms of within a correctional environment, misdemeanor crimes are going to be a day short of a year. 364 is the maximum sentence, although some individuals may have been convicted and given 3 or 2 what they call county years. So even though they're not in prison doing 3 or 4 years, they may be in the county doing these consecutive county or misdemeanor years. Enough said with the misdemeanors. Now within the felon community, you have different categories. You have violent felons, non-violent felons. Sometimes you have juveniles adjudicated as adults. So these are individuals below 18, but the legal system has adjudicated them as adults. You have males, you have females. So we have the department has a very detailed classification system. So it starts with the elements. Let's say we're looking at a funnel. Misdemeanor, felony, male, female, juvenile adjudicated as an adult, and then we start taking a deeper dive. Since we're talking about specifically males, and in this case, a male individual, let me move away now from females, juveniles adjudicated as adults, misdemeanors, and let's go within the felony space. So within the felony capacity, you have violent felons and nonviolent felons. Nonviolent felon could be someone charged with cocaine possession of a certain level, some sort of theft, any sort of crime that was nonviolent in nature. And then on the other leg, right, we keep kind of splitting apart, we have violent felons. And not all violent felons are the same. You may have someone with an aggravated battery or sexual battery, which is a technical name for rape, or murder. So all these individuals, the department always tries to classify them and keep them grouped. The last thing that you want is a white-collar individual that was arrested with, X number of grams of cocaine, which would be a felony, in the same cell with 20 individuals charged with first-degree murder. So makes sense so far?
Yes, it does. And how is that controlled with this overpopulation that we're facing in today's society in jail?
Okay, so excellent question, and again, I'm giving you the lab version, right? The perfect scenario. Now, what can happen is, depending on the physical constraints or the capacity of the facility, we start kind of ratcheting up and grouping. So the one thing you never mix is you're never going to mix males and females, right? So that's never a case. You're never going to mix juveniles and adults. Now, when you're in the felony space, if there's not enough capacity, if you're a felon and there's no room in the facility except for, let's say, a violent felon cell versus a misdemeanor cell, you can't go to the misdemeanor cell. You're going to go into the violent felon cell. And again, so it's very detailed. So the more crowded the facility get, they start truncating into these broader groups, making sure that they don't violate misdemeanor versus felon. In addition to, the individuals, when they come into the facility, they also get medically screened and psychologically screened. So they're trying to identify if they have any sort of psychological issues. And the department does have special housing area for psychologically disturbed persons, right, PDPs. And there's different levels, severe, lighter, etc., and it gets broken down in that case. If you want to take it to like the next level, there's individuals that have a higher predisposition for violence, so they may be kept maybe in a smaller cell or in something called a safety cell, which is kind of, in the movies they may call it solitary confinement. It's not really solitary confinement, but they may have, in a small cell they may have 2 or 3 individuals. In a safety cell, it may have just 1 individual in that cell, and those individuals receive very close monitoring.
So, very important that you mentioned something, mental health. Individuals that are arrested and you have identified that they are suffering from a mental health illness. There's something at the county that was called a hidden floor at one time, and the conditions were so bad that the media went in, and it was just completely, the regular citizen wouldn't be able to stomach the visions of what's going on in there, the drug feeding just to put these people to sleep. I myself, when I did a CIT class, a crisis intervention training class with the city, they took us for a tour of the facility when I was a police officer, and I was shocked myself to see that they had one individual in a straitjacket just completely zippered over his head, yelling and screaming, just laying on the floor in a corner with no one even attending to him. Could he have stayed there 10 minutes? Could he have stayed there an hour? Hours, days, I have no idea. But it kind of like hurt me inside just for that. And I see stuff on the streets all the time. So I could imagine you being in a facility, being faced with that stuff. What have you observed on that floor of mental health? And how hard is it to work in that environment? And do they rotate those guards in and out so they don't suffer from mental illness? or how is that? What's the assignment there? Is that a punishment for a guard?
Okay.
To be assigned there?
So the first comment is, so I never saw what you described. And now, in all candor, I was never assigned to that floor. I would visit that floor. I did have close friends that worked in that floor. So let's start from let's call it low mental health issues to severe mental health issues. In the low mental health issues, it may be, I mean, I'm not qualified to define it, but let's say maybe a person that's maybe a little delusional, maybe has some sort of depression, has been classified by our medical staff or the department's medical staff to have some sort of mental issue. They may be put in a broadly called like a general population mental health floor. Now, the more severely affected mental health individuals are put in a special floor where the officers have specialized training. So it's not a punishment. It's actually they get incentive pay, and they have to go through rigorous training and a selection process before they can be put on that floor. Within that floor, and I'm talking about the main jail, they have a number of wings, 3 specifically. Let me jump to, let's call it the most severe of the severe. So suicidal individuals that are trying to self-harm, etc. They are in a particular wing that has 24-hour observation, and it's under glass. So their particular cells, number one, are transparent. There's a nurse station in the middle of that cell. So you have and a psych nurse, so it's not just a regular nurse, observing those individuals, and you have permanent officers. The officers assigned to those teams are generally the permanent officers, so they are able to know the different personalities of the individuals. Now, when you're talking about straitjackets, I don't remember ever seeing straitjackets or using. We did have something, or do have something called a Ferguson suit. What happens is sometimes you have individuals that are highly suicidal, and in my experience, I mean, I had individuals that tried to overdose on Tylenol, would stuff styrofoam cups down their throat, would try to jump off a bunk, the classic hanging with a shirt, etc. So these are individuals that are obviously have some sort of psychological problem, but they need 24/7, this constant observation. So those individuals, since they are a potential harm to themselves, they are relieved of their clothing, but, and I don't know if it was a lawsuit or what took place at some point in the past, maybe it was, Ferguson versus Florida or whatever, but they came up with this concept of a Ferguson suit. And with the Ferguson suit, sometimes if you ever watch a person being arraigned on TV, it almost looks like a tank top, like a dark colored tank top that comes into their knees. So it's a very thick, almost kind of nylon fabric that wraps around 3 times around the individual. The arms come out like if it was a tank top, but it doesn't allow itself to be used for the individual to hurt themselves. So now they're given the dignity of being covered. There's really no way to use that fabric to strangle yourself, right? So that's maybe what some people have either seen or alluded within my experience there. Ultimately, you still may have individuals that, in spite of all the best efforts, are still trying to hurt themselves by either running onto walls, jumping off bunks, and those individuals may be restrained, maybe put, and I'm not sure if it's still done, but maybe in a 2 or 4 point restraint. But again, once they're in that situation, constant observation, and there's checklists. Even other individuals that aren't in constant observation, they may have 15-minute checklists where the officer has to physically go to the cell, visualize what the individual or what the inmate is doing, and document it. Watching TV, reading, sleeping, etc. So it's a very very regimented area. And again, I forgot if it was 5 or 10%. The officers are even incentivized once they get the specialized training. It's reflected in their compensation.
Now, I did see, and these articles are open on the internet, that the news media went in there. Obviously mental health issues. They've observed people drinking out of dirty toilet water. What is done in a situation like that, where you have somebody that's starting to be out of control, throwing fecal matter at the glass cell windows, or even through the cells of the bars at guards, incidents where they throw urine at guards? What kind of punishment are they facing when they do this? Is it like the overall ass whipping sort of say, or is it the more tamed down SWAT team goes in and neutralizes this individual in a safe way?
Okay, so first, words means things. So from a technical aspect, they're not guards; they're correctional officers, right? And those individuals, and going back to my respect for the profession and the individuals, they see themselves as professionals, right? Not just a guard, not just a turnkey. I'll expand on it. So at least when I went through, so the academy for a county correction officer was about 4.5 months versus a police officer, which was, I think, 6 months at that time. This was at one of the training facilities here in Dade County. Difference being, you didn't get the extension of when you're engaging a subject on the street, etc. Compare a county correction officer with a state correction officer, which the training's even less, maybe 3 months. The big difference being is with county correction officers, typically you're dealing with pre-trial detainees. So those individuals, not only are they innocent until proven guilty, they're still in possession of their rights versus a state convicted felon that they've lost certain rights. So the training required by a county correction officer exceeds, right, the minimum standard. So you have psychology training, you have legal training, understanding how to act under color of law. So it's a little bit more involved, so just from a terminology standpoint. Now, in terms of like say an event that you described, well, first of all, the cell structure within the county, and who knows if they're being retrofitted when they're modernized, are of two types. So for general population, generally is what you see in the movies, and this is at the Pre-Trial Detention Center, TGK, Metro West. The other facilities are different, are more like barracks. But at the main jail that we're talking about, PTDC, Pre-Trial Detention Center, DCJ, main jail, same name, different names for the same place. You have general pop floors, which are bars. Like you see in the movie, you have a catwalk. Once you get above a certain floor, and this was an added floor, I forgot if it was 4 floors back in the 70s, now the structure is more under glass. So it's not a bar set where you can kind of have to go in and look through. You have sliding doors, you have thick plexiglass windows that allows you to see into the particular cells. So now the risk, especially when you're dealing, and the psychological inmates are in that type of floor, as are the juveniles adjudicated as adults, at least during the time I was there. They're under glass. So now I can see them, but if they were to throw fecal matter or something of that nature at the officer, it's going to hit the plexiglass. It's not going through the bars. But let's say you have an individual that was maybe in a low risk floor where you have psychologically disturbed individuals, but they're inoffensive, maybe same type of people that you come across on the street. You'll see them talking to themselves, but they're not bothering you, they're not bothering anybody, and that individual escalates and gets violent. Like most answers to most things, it depends. If you see it and now you need to take action, it's a pretty formalized process in terms of the type of plan. You have protective gear, and when I say protective, just from infection. So back in those days, maybe you had your mask, your gloves, eye protection, something so that you wouldn't get contaminated, and there'd be some sort of strategy to restrain that individual. A typical strategy is you may have different officers assigned to different limbs of the individual. You have a controlling, typically either a sergeant or a lieutenant, kind of directing the action of the officers, and each officer has their assignment. The goal being to secure that individual and get him into handcuffs, right, so where he can hold him, he can't hurt himself. Now that's a scenario where you have the benefit of time, and you have that time dimension. Now, when it's spontaneous, where an officer gets attacked, then you have to react and defend yourself to some point. Now, as far as retaliation, the retaliation was never condoned. Do you hear stories that it's happened? Yes. So sometimes you see, an individual that maybe looks like he has some injuries. Yes. As far as my, personal observations, typically, no. You were able to either get the person to comply through verbal orders, or if physical action was required, it was planned. I'll give you a specific instance. So one time with a severely mentally disturbed individual, he was in a safety cell by himself, actually in the clinic for treatment. Now this individual was inside a cell that was maybe, I don't know, maybe 4 by 6, just a small holding cell in the clinic. He was talking to 4 individuals in the corner of his cell. It was an empty cell, so he was delusional. And he really needed to get out. We needed to treat him. Nursing staff had to see him. Very violent. He had threatened staff. He had threatened nurse. So the lieutenant on duty got, 4 officers, 5 officers. We came up with a plan. Each officer was assigned a limb, a leg, the other leg, right arm, left arm. And during those days, we didn't have shield, but we did have like soft mattresses. And the individual was given verbal orders before the cell door was open. Tell him, turn around or get face down, put your hands behind your back 3 or 4 times. He was warned that if he didn't comply, there would be force used to subdue him. In this case, the individual didn't comply. The gate was open. We immediately rushed into the cell. Everyone took their assigned limb. The individual was taken down, turned on his stomach. He was put into handcuffs, then on a gurney, and then on the gurney, 4-point restraint, so he could. I think they were shipping him. They were going to ship them to a mental health facility for someone that was in severe crisis. So I give you that example because that's that was my experience in that case. Understand, I wasn't on the psych floor. This just happened to be, I was in the area, in the clinic, and the lieutenant grabbed 4 officers and developed the plan.
So what's the span of control, officers versus inmates? And is there like a union number, sort of say? I'm sure you have a union.
Right, so the PBA is a union. So, it depends on the facility. Maybe something that'll help you and help your viewers understand, jails and prisons is the type of facility. So there's 3. There's first generation, second generation, and third generation. Second generation was a blip, but I'll talk about it. But I'm going to skip it because it's hard to understand without first understanding first and third generation. So first generation is what you see in the movies, the main jail. You have bars, you have a catwalk. The inmates are in the cage or in the jail, in the cell, and the officers are on the outside. So the interaction model is very distant. So no relationships are formed. And typically the officer's responding when there's some sort of issue, there's a fight, there's someone that's sick, but you don't really kind of build that rapport. And at the same time, there's an officer walking on what's called the catwalk on the outer perimeter of the cells. There's no way to get in and out of the cells from the outer perimeter. It's just visual through the bars. And that's where the inmates put their request to go to the clinic, visitation, etc. So that's first generation. That tends to be the most dangerous for officers, for inmates, because the observation time is limited. You have an officer walking a catwalk that encompasses 4 times 3, 12 cells in some floors. Now contrast that with third generation. I'm skipping a second. So third generation is like a Metro West, TGK. So even though when I say this, it's going to sound a little bit more dangerous for the officer, it's actually not. So third generation, like Metro West, imagine like an army barracks. So you've got a rectangular room, you've got double bunk beds, you've got 4 TVs in the middle, maybe you have a day room, you've got like an eating area and a head or a bathroom and showers, etc. The officer is locked in there with those inmates. One officer could be 64 inmates, and these are felons, violent felons, etc. And you say, well, I'd rather work in the first generation where they're behind bars versus third generation, but it's quite the opposite. Part of it is typically officers are assigned to those cells permanently, so they get to know the personalities of the inmates, what's going on. You have a daily head count. As you do the head count, you have their index card, their charges. You kind of know what's going on with those inmates, and by the same token, they get to know you and your personality, right? You have to be a little bit more guarded because it's easier to get manipulated because they see. But That's third generation. Second generation is kind of a hybrid. I think the only facility that we had kind of like that, if I remember correctly, was a women's annex. So imagine what I described sort of like a third generation, and the officer booth is almost like a bubble within the cell. So you're kind of in there, but you're not. So it's not, sport. The most cost effective and one of the ones that reduced a lot of violent acts was third generation. Why? The officer is walking amongst the inmates. You're kind of checking up on them. You know the personality. If you're a verbose, jovial type of inmate, and next thing you came from court, and now you're sitting in the corner, sullen, quiet. As a good officer, I realized, hey, I know Jeff to be outgoing. Now he's sitting there. What's going on? Maybe he got serious charges. Maybe his wife left him. Who knows? But you interact on that level. So it's actually a little, not a little. I think quite a bit safer. Even though to a civilian or somebody that's not aware, they say, "Well, there's no way I'd want to work in that environment." Having said that, there are violent events. I mean, we are dealing with felons. We are dealing with people that aren't rule followers. You have fights between the inmates, and now they have to be separated. So you do have these issues, but generally those are the two type of facilities that we have, and that's kind of like the ratio. The main jail, I mean, it could be depending on the floor. It could be 5 officers on a floor. You have a booth officer that's a controller, and then you have the wing officer, and it's it's a very busy environment, right? During the day, they're pulling for court, they're pulling for yard, they're pulling for clinic, visitation. In the evenings, you have visitation. So there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of dynamics going on. Third generation, typically some of the cells have visitation booths that are part of the cell. So they're like a TGK. The inmate doesn't have to leave the cell if it's an under glass visit. Just a definitional for purpose. You have contact and under glass. Under glass, the inmate will be in a booth. You'll see him through a glass. Either you talk through a phone or through a little speaker. Contact visit, you're in the physical proximity. You're in a room. You're there. There's no contact allowed, but you're within inches or feet of your visitor. Highly monitored. You'll have 2 or 3 officers kind of watching, make sure no contraband passes hands, etc.
And did you want to touch base on the second generation?
Sorry, I thought I did. So second generation would be something like if I remember correctly, the women's annex. I didn't spend a long time there, where imagine you have a cell, and jutting into the cell, you'll have it's not a bubble, but imagine that you have like a bubble office. So you're kind of in there, surrounded. Have you ever gone to one of the aquariums, like in Atlanta, the Atlanta Aquarium, where you
Yes.
where you're walking through a tank and there's sharks and everything swimming around you, but you're walking through a tunnel so you could see them. They can see you, but there's a plexiglass there. So that's kind of like second generation. That wasn't. I don't think that was an ideal setup, because it was almost worse than first generation. At least first generation, you've got smaller cells, you've got visual contact always. The officer's doing administration. The optimal is a third generation from both economics, housing, and violence. P.S. With the first generation, given the way the structure is, you have an officer walking around, but he's in this cell today. Now, 15 minutes later, he's on the other wing. He's talking to inmates. He's collecting different forms. Basically, the inmates are running the cell, so to speak. Third generation, you're in there. So you, as a good officer, you're going to identify if you have somebody that's potentially a victim or vulnerable. Maybe, so he could be a felon, but maybe he's slight in stature. Maybe it's his first time, and then you have some other seasoned prisoners. So you may keep a close eye on that individual. You may put him on a bunk that's close to the officer's desk. So imagine the cell layout being a large rectangular bay, kind of like a warehouse. And you've got, along both sides, you've got double bunk beds, and you've got some bunk beds in the back. You get some kid that's 18, maybe weighs 120 pounds, got caught with X number of grams of coke. Now he's got a felony charge, and he may be in the same cell with a bunch of guys that are hardcore felons, done a lot of time. You want to keep a close eye on that individual, and maybe you want to put him over in bunk 68 all the way in the back in the corner. Maybe you want him in bunk 1, bunk 2, where you have your officer's desk and you can keep a visual on this individual.
So what generation was the Broward correctional officer that was attacked by, I believe, the Parkland shooter, where the shooter was by himself, and he was sitting there, and it took quite some time for this guy to get help. I mean, this was like a death fight almost. So he could have been strangled. He could have been anything.
Yeah. So I saw that, and again, I didn't work for Broward County, and I did see that video. A number of comments there. So number one, so that was a kind of a third generation setup, very similar to the TGK. So TGK is like that. It's two-tiered. You have individual rooms. Typically, when you have, and that individual, so let me do this. I don't know Broward County's policy, and again, I'm not an expert right now in Dade County's policy. I can tell you within the safety cell environment, so let's use TGK as an example, right? So TGK, you have what I described at Metro West. The only difference, the shape is different, and there's individual rooms. So Metro West, big military style barracks. TGK, like a garden apartment, right? Where in the middle the officer's sitting. You have typically, and most of the TV shows, they'll use that third generation two-tier model. There's individual rooms. Typically you have one or two inmates assigned to a room, and the doors are open most of the shift, unless it's a lockdown or you're doing head count and they have to go to their bunks. But it's an open area, albeit they each have one or two person rooms. So what I saw in that Broward case was a third generation facility, very similar to, let's say, TGK, but I don't even want to say surprised. I mean, it would be crazy that individual wouldn't be in the high security or like a safety cell environment. The cell structure is the same, but the treatment of the inmate is what's different. So imagine what you saw in that video. So general population would be in that same type of cell, but everybody would be loose during the normal shift until lockdown, where you do your head counts. In the safety cell environment, the individuals are locked in these individual cells, and typically when they're high profile, violent, or of note, police officer, public figure, etc., they're going to be kept in these cells individually, and you do not allow multiple inmates in this category out at the same time. The Florida statute relating to jails is 33-8, and there's specific rules in terms of lighting, how many hours they get out. So you know your listeners or watchers can just look at Florida statute 33-8, and it'll tell them about facilities. Now, in that one in particular, number one, I was surprised. Another definition. So there's different level of inmates. In the Dade County system, a level 1 inmate is the highest level of risk. And there's things associated with being a level 1 inmate. Typically, you'll see them in the red jumper. They have to wear belly chains and ankle chains when they're moved. They're never moved by an individual officer. Typically, there's a supervisor, there's multiple officers. There's a whole process around moving a quote-unquote level 1. Think about somebody that is a death row inmate, was convicted, or maybe they had a second charge. They bring them down from upstate. These are level 1 inmates. The treatment is much more acute, and it's always many to one. It's never going to be a one-on-one situation. So one of the observations that I made from the video, and again, I don't want to Monday morning quarterback an officer or process. I don't know what BSO's process is, but I'm going to go on this assumption that kid was a level 1 inmate, not only for the type of crime, but the notoriety. So a kid like that, you don't want in general population, right? He's been on TV. Who knows what's going to happen? So he's going to be, more than likely, that was a safety cell. And if you look, all the cells were locked. All the doors were closed in the area when they let him out. You know, there's an old saying, complacency kills. If you're dealing with a level 1, and again, I'm going to assume, I don't know that kid was a level 1 inmate. I even questioned myself, like how would you let a level 1 inmate out with just one officer in the cell? So that's question one, right? Maybe their policy allows it, maybe they change it, but you never let out a level 1 inmate, right? I worked with some individuals that let me just say, I'm glad we were on the same team. These officers were good officers, strict officers, but they packed the gear. And they would never, by themselves, allow a level 1 inmate. There's a whole protocol. So, point one. Point two, on the officer, and again, this is where complacency, maybe as a kid, I didn't, from the police department uses the same terminology, the FI stance, the field interrogation stance, where your body's bladed, you're facing the individual, your hands are above your waist, you're making sure you're looking at what's going on. I think the officer was looking around at the desk when the guy took a good thing. I think the officer was able to eventually turn the tables on him, but imagine if that guy had a weapon on him, a shank or something. So there was a little bit, what appeared to me as some complacency there. But again, if it was Dade County, I can tell you that if that was that individual, the smart bet would be, he would be in a safety cell, and if it would be in a safety cell unit, there's multiple officers there, and it's very regimented.
Just so our viewers know that don't follow a lot of the news, the Parkland school shooter was a mass murderer that was recently convicted for shooting in a school, and he was convicted to life in prison. And it's hard to believe this day and time that that could happen with a guard, because luckily the guard was in shape. A correction officer, correct.
I'm going to call you on it.
All right, I got you. And believe me, I have the utmost respect for correctional officers, because to me, your job is a lot harder than a police officer. Like you said, the police officers are policing the city, and within that city, you have little kids, you have people that look up to police officers, you have good people that you go to the corner and you get Cuban coffee, but you can break away from your call, bad people, and go to La Carreta, a Cuban restaurant, get out of that environment. But when you go to work, you are the police officer of a city that is infested with criminals. And that is a remarkable task to take on. What is the suicide rate amongst correctional officers?
So I don't know the precise numbers.
Just so you know, when I was a spokesperson with the city, I handled two of them, correctional officers, one of them in uniform on Northwest 20th Street that shot himself in the head when he left the facility, and he was underneath the expressway in the car. Right. So it does happen. One is too many, right, but it's obviously the impact that it has, the job has on you, not just police officers, but correctional officers.
Right. So what I can tell you, it's high. The divorce rate is high. The death rate post-retirement is high. I was very fortunate in that I never identified. I was a professional in my job. I never identified with the job per se, and I had outside pursuits and hobbies, and I had a good core of other officers that we would work out together, mountain bike together, and we didn't define ourselves by the job. Some individuals, it doesn't have to be corrections, it could be finance, legal, law. If you identify too close with the job, everything really takes a toll. What I can tell you is it's kind of a slow boil, a slow cook. And what I mean by that, so, I grew up, I'm not going to say, super hard, but not soft either. I grew up in a hard neighborhood. Was involved in martial arts, thought myself pretty tough. The first time I went on the tour of the jail, once I went into the academy, it was an adjustment. I had a Parker moment. A lot of big individuals, very aggressive. Part of it, they were putting on a show because they knew we were rookies. Muscular, back in those days, they like wearing gold teeth. They were biting, they were threatening. And even though I had grown up kind of in a rough neighborhood, I had like an oh shit moment. It's like, holy crap. But you get used to it. And I bring that up because, so once you're in the day-to-day, and additionally, the inmates, they know when you're new. Just a tip for any correction officer wannabes out there, don't fake it. If you're new, let them know you're new, but let them know, I may not know today, but I'll know tomorrow. The worst thing you can do is to pretend that you're a seasoned vet. They know right away. You have a very shiny badge. You have your 2 pens, the way that you act. So an interesting thing. So you're working and it becomes like a normal job, and show up and you build strong, relationships with other officers and civilian staff, and it's normal. You go on vacation, and the county has pretty liberal vacation policy. I think you get 4 weeks, 480 hours. You go on vacation for 2 weeks, come back, and it would take me 3-4 days to get used to the rhythm. I felt myself always, when I got back, a little anxious, a little more nervous, and then I'd melt into it. Well, I wasn't melting back into the process. What it was is that my body was probably moving up into a higher level of attention, of stress, and I just found that as a new normal. So I believe that those are like the invisible either killers or impact on the officer, where now it seems very normal. What you don't realize, it's normal to you because you've been sitting in that for 10, 20, 15 years. You're really kind of redlining your body. It's when you leave that your body comes down that all those defects come. So going back to the suicide rate, I remember, and I'm a religious person. I believe in God, but I'm not a Bible thumper. But I remember one of the very religious officers that I met early in my career. He gave me a couple of pieces of advice. And again, this is good advice for anybody that's thinking about getting into that career. So one, super important, never make any of those guys your enemy. Do your job, do what you have to do, but never make it personal. Friendly but unfamiliar, fair but firm. Do what you have to do. Never take it personal, because you never know what can happen. The other part is, and this was the religious part, he goes, realize that you are in the funnel of evil. At one point, I think you talked about 4,000. There was a point where there was 6,000 inmates. Overcrowding was rampant. I think the county was getting fined by the federal government. So imagine being in a building. Let's call it, the main jail's 10 stories, but maybe the footprint itself is, maybe 100 by 1,000 square feet in terms of footprint. You got 6,000 evil people in that building. That opens the door to the devil, to everything that's negative. You're in there. You're part of that. So that has to have an effect. You have individuals that are constantly, the most dangerous inmate, in my opinion, was not the physically aggressive one. You could see that individual coming. It was the manipulative one. You should tell us they have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to study you.
What viewers and people don't understand, and how it leads to divorces and stress, you're living, you're breathing that environment with individuals that you're spending more time with than your wife and kids. Because when you look at reality, 10 hours or 8-hour shift is still an hour to get there, hour to get home, 8 quality hours with the wife and kids. But you go outside, you cut the grass, that's 30 minutes away from the family. You go get gas for the wife, you get gas for yourself, another hour away. Kids might be in school. If you're off during the weekday, you might have to miss your kid's birthday because you have shift duty. And then you go to sleep another 8 hours. So sometimes you're only 3 to 4 quality hours with your family, and you're 8 hours in this cesspool environment.
Right. Well, Jeff, you'd be lucky if it was 4, because think about this. So the day has 24 hours. Of the 24-hour days, 16 hours is afternoon shift, 3 to 11, and the other 16 or 8 is midnight, right? 11 to 7.
I didn't think about that. You're correct.
So if you think about if you think about this, if you're an officer, I'll use 3 to 11 as an example. So if your wife is working a 9 to 5 and your kids are in school, and your tour duty starts at 3, you're heading out to work at about 2. So you're not seeing the kids when they come home, and the wife doesn't get home till 5, right? So you have some daycare. And now, you get off duty at 11 o'clock at night. So 11 o'clock at night, you're just not blinking like a bewitched, maybe I'm dating myself, and home. Now you got to drive home, and then maybe your uniform's dirty, maybe you had to use a force, maybe you had to write an incident report, maybe you were late. But now, by the time you get home, it may be 11:30, midnight. But it's not like you get there and all of a sudden just lay in bed. Now you got to take a shower. You don't want to bring the jail home. So now you got to take a shower, take your uniform off, and you're still wound up. I mean, you've been working. So it may be 1 or 2 in the morning. Now, the next day, maybe your wife takes the kids to school. So maybe you're sleeping next to your wife, and now you're sleeping in because you didn't get to sleep till 2 or 3 in the morning because you're still wound up. And then when you wake up, kids are in school, wife's gone, and that's where the camaraderie and the tightness with like the brotherhood takes place. Now you're going to the gym with the guy that works with you on your shift, or maybe you're going to mountain bike, or you're going to the beach, and then you're going on duty and you're starting again. Now you're off Tuesday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The whole world is off on the weekends. So you don't socialize with normal people because you're working on the weekend. And now your wife's friend, her and her husband are going to the movies. They invite you. Now, if you want to go, you got to try to get a day off. You got to put it in the book. So there's other stresses outside of the job. And I think that also, unless you make a concerted effort at making sure that time you have with your family, in my case, Saturdays, I work Saturday. I mean, my whole career, I worked weekends. But I made sure that Saturday morning and Sunday morning, I got up early. I spent time with family. Maybe we went to the beach, have my uniform in my vehicle, maybe go in 2 vehicles, and then leave from there and go to work. So you spend that time because it's so limited. So I think that also contributes, not just the job linearly itself, but the meta, right? The external stuff.
So you had mentioned Bewitched and dating yourself. We don't just have a YouTube channel. They're listening to us on podcast, and a lot of the listeners out there might say, is this guy Alex an old man, because they hear you rocking back and forth in that chair that we have to put WD-40 on there? And no, he's not. If they wanted to look at one of your workout resumes, where could they go? I'm fascinated myself. I know you're into jiu-jitsu. I was into Kempo karate myself, but your workouts are just far beyond any Rocky movie I've seen. If a viewer wanted to go out there, or a listener, and see you work out, where would they go?
Well, so thanks for the plug. It's starting right now. It's very casual, but so I created a YouTube channel called Brainy Meathead, because I'm a brainy meathead. so I'm brainy on some things, a meathead on other, and they come together. So if you look at Brainy Meathead or AAA Gun Safety for any gun related items, I've got some videos there. But one of the things that I guess I'd like to share with your viewers is the age factor is key as you get older, but going back to the corrections, going back to where I am today, exercise is a gateway drug to success in just about everything. If you exercise, age becomes less relevant, and I think one of the elements that kept me sound, I was able to do a number of different things. I mean, I went through SRT school, I went through the Army's drill instructor school for the boot camp. I always challenged myself and tried to learn and do more. Was the fact that exercise has been kind of that constant rudder. No matter how bad a day, no matter what happened, I always knew that Mr. York's name was on a piece of iron connected to a bar that I could lift and move, and at the end of 45 minutes to 60 minutes, I did something, and it helped relieve the stress. So that's carried on me. And yes, I may be a little long in the tooth, great. Well, I'm bald, so I don't have gray hair. Oh, I do, but it's inside. But that exercise component. So I share that with whether it's a police officer, correction officer, anyone in a high stress. You need to make. I'm telling you, exercise is the gateway drug to improving all aspects of your life. It gives you discipline. It gives you an end-to-end success in that moment. You start to work out at 6 o'clock in the morning. You finish at 7. You've accomplished something that's very important. And again, from a stress relieving standpoint, and if you are an officer, now you are stronger, you are fitter, you are more able to handle your situation.
And what people don't understand also, that is kind of like your invisible partner. Because when your partner is not there and you got Mr. York giving you biceps where you can go that extra mile, that extra minute, sometimes that extra second, and even for police officers on the street, God forbid you get shot, unless it's like a fatal hit to your head, your brain, your heart, or if you have a vest on, that survival is just so much greater if you're in shape.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll use a number thing. Maybe it'll help people visualize, because like everyone will get tired. But if you're in shape, especially, and this goes to law enforcement, right, in terms of engaging a subject, at the beginning of an interaction, everybody's at level 10. Adrenaline's pumping, everyone's strong. But if you're in shape, if you're training, if you have cardio, if you have strength, the way that you are going to erode that strength is going to be 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you're not in shape, it's going to be 10, 5, 1. So if you want to think about the parallels, if you're that first guy, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 3, you've got a lot more fuel in the tank to kind of handle the situation versus the first guy. If you go from 10 to 5 to 1, so what's your only option? You got to go DEFCON 5. You got to go for a weapon. You got to escalate. Versus the other one, you have a little more control. One of the things that I observed in my days as a correction officer is there's a lot of fights. Most of the fights are inmate, right? It's not like in the movies, officer, inmate. It's going to be inmate. Everybody starts out at a 10. Almost immediately, it goes not even 10, 5, 1, 10, 2, 1. They go. Next thing you know, they're gassed within seconds. So if you're an officer, one of the things, and I don't know if this is a digression, but I see some of these videos, and again, I'm passionate about it just because, I feel that sometimes ignorance, right, is what causes some of these situations that we see in the news with officers. The more confident you are in your ability to kind of dial in the right number, the less prone you're going to be to go to the absolute result, right? Whether it's weapon, firearm, whatever it is you choose. Being in shape, being strong, you're able to modulate the situation. And what you do is it allows you to stand back and see, oh, wait a second. You can almost feel the other person. And this goes from grappling, from jiu-jitsu. You can almost feel the other person's energy just immediately evaporate. And now you can use your restraint devices. You can put your handcuff. And now something that if you panicked and you really didn't have confidence in yourself to sustain something over, 2, 3, 4 minutes, doesn't sound like a lot, but those of us that, if you're in a real fight or you've sparred or, you've done anything, you know that a minute is a lifetime. So guess what? A lot of these people that are in shape, yes, they come out strong out of the chute, but within that minute, they start running out of gas. And if you're an officer that's in shape, now you can control the situation, you're more confident, and you don't allow the situation to escalate. So just a little side.
So I want you to touch on 3 things for our viewers and listeners. Classifications. How would you classify or separate gang members when they're arrested? Obviously, you can't have rival gangs together in a cell. How would you classify police officers that are arrested? I know even in our own department, they get arrested for domestic violence like everybody else. Some of them were actually arrested for sex with minors, as right. the Jesse claims as well, that they have to go there and they're actually behind, bars waiting for a trial just like everybody else. What treatment do they get when they're behind bars? Obviously, I don't think they could put them around general population because they probably arrested some people that they may be identified by. What would Jesse's situation is a little different. Right now, it's federal. The state didn't pursue charges on him, which would have put him at the Dade County facility. So now he's awaiting trial or awaiting a plea deal. And either one, if unless he's not convicted, there'll come a day where he's going to have to surrender himself. So I want you to touch on the Dade County facility and then maybe what he might be facing if he faces that time of surrendering himself.
Okay. So I'll just lightly touch, as far as gang affiliation, fortunately in Miami-Dade, we've never had the same level of kind of gang activity that you see in California, where you have multi-generational gangs, or Chicago or New York. We did have, I know during the 90s there was the Zopound, which is a Haitian gang, and the Tutu Avenue Players back in the 80s. All these, that's never been an issue. One of the issues in terms of turf and more with the juveniles, it's down south and north. So if individuals were from, let's say, Liberty City, Overtown, maybe Opelika, keeping them separate from the individuals that were arrested, like in Goulds, Homestead, and South. So there was that issue. You also always want a balance in the cell, right? Within the correctional environment, typically, they try to keep what's called a racial cell balance. And again, this isn't being like racist, but all the facilities, you see all the documentaries in the prisons in California and Texas, folks tend to affiliate with the same race, whether it's African American, Hispanic American, Anglo American, and it kind of breaks down in that way. So what you don't want is you don't want to sell with, 90% Anglo American skinhead, and you have 2 African Americans in there, right? So there's that aspect. Now let me jump to a law enforcement officer coming to the facility. So that's very tricky, and the departments, the good departments, will typically are going to be acute to that and know, and even, going back to what I said at the beginning, if you can remember, for the most part, correctional officer, correctional staff, normal human beings doing a job, wanting to earn an income, insurance, they have families, they have kids, so they're not there, there's no agenda. This is not a movie, this is a job, you do it, etc. So everybody wants to do their job as best they can, because what they want to do is they want to preserve the next paycheck, and they want to preserve their pension, their benefits, etc. So with any law enforcement, police, corrections, even fire department, you have to have special care because of what you said, right? There could be not only individuals that they arrested, low probability maybe, but just the fact that you're a cop in jail. Well, there's a high value. They call it, scoring points, right? So if I'm an inmate, or like the guy, remember Jeffrey Dahmer, or what's the guy from Boston that they made the movie, the Irish guy that just got killed? I want to say, not Bugsy. What's his name? They made the movie with the Irish guys. Anyway, it'll come to me. But let's just use Jeffrey Dahmer, or that pedophile priest in Chicago that was shanked. Or it'll come to me, the Irish guy. You say, how can that happen? Well, first of all, people are human beings. People make mistakes. Sometimes, you go to Burger King, you say no tomatoes, and you get it, and you get double tomatoes, right? So same thing. I mean, somebody made a mistake. Obviously, the consequences are higher. So that can happen. Now, with a police officer, number one, so you have a police officer environment that an inmate says, well, if I can, let's forget about injuring with killing the guy. I said just punching him in the face. I punch Officer Jeff Giordano, who just came into jail, in the face, knock him out. I'm gonna get a lot of cred within the inmate population, right? I just sparked, a PO, right? So there's that bounty. Forget about the personal. Oh, you arrested me, right? You're gonna score points just because you're a PO, I'm an inmate, I knocked you out, everybody. Now, if I have serious charges or I'm never getting out, if I take it to the next level, even more, right? Wow, I dusted off, that pig that came in, right? So there's that element. On the other part, and this is a warning to any law enforcement officers that go into the system, you can have a situation where maybe they have a sense of entitlement because, I'm an officer, you guys got to treat me this. But no, at that point, you're an inmate. So you may have some resentment from the officer community thinking, hey, you made everybody look bad. You've tainted everybody. And now don't think you're going to come here and just because you were, let's say, a dirty cop, or that you're going to run things, right? So it's almost a double-edged sword, or not even a double-edged sword, a double-edged attack. You have the inmate, and then you have the officers that are looking down on you. So one piece of advice, and I used to tell this to not officers, but just general inmates. The best thing you can do is, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Although on this podcast, obviously, I'm running my mouth, but that's the whole purpose. So that means that God wanted you to listen twice as much as talk. Don't say a lot. Keep your head down. Work out. You're never going to make a friend in there. Here, I'm going to look at the camera. You will never, ever make a friend in jail or in prison. There's always a hidden agenda. There's nothing you can ever do to make these people be your friend. There's always what's in it for me. So remember that. Anyway, so keep your head low. Don't try to ingratiate yourself with officers. Don't try to ingratiate yourself with staff. Do your time, and then you have to be vigilant. complacency kills. You have to realize that you have multiple targets on you. So you always have to be on high alert. Because if you're an officer, even in federal prison, and typically, depending on like if you go to a federal penitentiary, like Leavenworth, where you have bikers or you have some of these, very violent gangs that do, cross-border, cross-state crimes, that's a different story. A lot of times, whether it's like, I think Eglin has a prison, these minimum securities, you have a lot of white-collar criminals, less violent, less chance, but you never know who's there, regardless. You keep your mouth, what's the old saying we used to have, even a fish would have stayed out of trouble if they kept their mouth shut. Keep to yourself, do your workouts. If anything, and again, I second time I mentioned religion, and again, I'm not like one of these Bible thumpers, but you get involved in typically the inmates and prisoners that are kind of in the religious part. Maybe they're doing it for show or whatever, but at least they're behaving in a certain way that's consistent with being pious or being religious. So lower chance or lower probability of something taking off, because even if they are trying to scam the system, they're trying to project an image that now, they found the way, they found Jesus. So less risky, but at the same time, if you're an officer and you're doing time, you will never, ever be safe, unless you're like in solitary confinement. And even then, you got to go to the clinic, you got to be pulled for court, you got to do, there's certain things where there may be a chance. So my advice to any officer doing time is, head on a swivel, do your time, keep your head low, don't make friends, don't try to chummy up with the officers, don't leverage the fact that you were a former cop and this. Just be one of those guys that you're quiet, you're respectful, and going back to my workout thing, the gateway drug to improvement, workout. If you project, these a lot of these inmates are predatory in nature. If you project weakness, they're gonna sense it. They're gonna take advantage of it. If you project strength without being, Mr. Macho Guy, I can kick your ass, whatever, but you're gonna be a hard target. Now you're gonna either reduce the probability or you're gonna force them to up the ante if they're gonna try to do something to you, which means more action, more eyeballs, right? So if you think you can take me very easy, maybe you come into my cell and you jump me. If you think that I'm gonna pose a significant risk to you, well, now you're gonna have to get, a few of your friends to come in, more people, more visuality, more activity. It may draw attention, because there's some officers, and I know in there's been cases where, solitary confinement, everybody says, well, yeah, I'll do solitary confinement, I'll be in there by myself. It can drive people crazy. The human interaction, we're human, we're social. There's been officers that say, no, put me in general pop, and then they've paid the price. So it's a
So the
trade-off.
food is not going to be any different for an officer behind bars, right?
No,
they don't have a special chef for them. Politicians, they just kind of eat whatever's given to the general population.
It's general population, unless you have like a religious diet, right? So you have to eat kosher, or if you're Muslim and you eat, it has to be halal, or you have diabetes. There's medical diets, right? So we're dealing with human beings, and we do have, at least in the Miami-Dade County system, medical diets. But the food's not going to be any different. You have commissary, you have food that you can order, but it's going to be the same
general
same
food.
as anyone.
Now, this is on a whole separate season that we're doing on the Mark Sievers case and the book that I wrote. But he was Jewish, and they gave him a Jewish diet. But the problem with that is they also had his name on the food tray, and they were putting wood chips in there. They were masturbating in his food to a point where he had to say, he just had to eat the regular food, because they knew of his charges, murder for hire, wife was killed. That and in this case, if you're an officer and you're even away from general population, and they see officer such and such name on there, you're going to get a special treatment. If you're like even Jewish, and they know it's going to an officer, they're not going to just send you this grand old kosher spaghetti over there. It's going to be kosher, but in a different way.
Right. So So it goes back, it goes back to the officers, right? Typically, when you have medical diets, they're treated, but every department is different. And I mean, we could see what just happened with the FAA and the flight grounding, and you think to yourself, hold on, planes, people, FAA, professionals, and something screwed up in their system. So for sure, something could screw up in a correctional environment. So can that happen? Yeah. Typically, within the kitchen environment, the inmates are under high scrutiny because they're tethered to the table, but you have knives, you have walk-in ovens, you have walk-in freezers, you have these enormous mixers that are about the size of a jacuzzi. So imagine one of those Betty Crocker mixers that you use for cake. Imagine one the size of a jacuzzi, where as that thing is spinning, you can toss somebody in there. So there's a lot of scrutiny in that environment. Now, maybe the best answer. So if I was an officer and I was going to do time, I would not do anything to distinguish myself. I would just want to be, in the general sense, just another inmate. Even if wouldn't talk to anybody, wouldn't share any details about my case, nothing. I would work out. I would be one of those people that the other inmates would say, well, yeah, that dude, he doesn't talk to anybody. He works out all the time. He prays. He goes to the church. He goes to chapel. He just stays to himself. That way, less attention is better, especially if you're doing time and you were a former officer.
So in the Sergeant Jesus Menocal case, there's no DNA evidence. There's just basically a he said, she said. The majority of the victims and the allegations, they're 24th Street Avenue gang members. No credibility whatsoever. But unfortunately, if one of those individuals, he were to be able to be found guilty, he could be looking at life in prison. So he may be forced to take a plea for some lesser charges versus life in prison. But just like Jesus Menocal is facing that, there's a lot of individuals out there in banking institutions, in professional environment, or even in low-income areas that get charged falsely and accused of crimes, and they find themselves in a correctional facility. But there you have it. If you're a police officer out there facing charges, going to jail, or a regular citizen, you just heard what happens behind closed doors at the Miami-Dade Correctional Facility, and I assure you, this is what happens to almost every facility throughout the United States. Stay out of trouble, stay safe, and stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you. Are you a fan of our show? Do you like our show? Then comment, hit the like button, and subscribe, or you might be the next one we investigate.